Mr. Osman, you said before Jesus Christ did not live during the Roman time, but much earlier. When do you think Jesus Christ lived?
Okay. Obviously, the New Testament is not a book of history, and in fact, it doesn't give us much information about the character of Jesus. 2 of the 4 Gospels do not even mention his birth, although the most important things about Jesus is his birth and his death. Between that, there's nothing much to say, except that he's collecting his disciples and so on. Most of it teaching really come later. However, there are 2 points in the Gospels, 2 points in the New Testament that can lead us to exactly the historical, who was the historical Jesus. When Luke, in Luke 2:32, 132, chapter 132, the angel comes to Mary and tell her she will get a child, and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and he will sit on the throne of his father David. This is very strange. This is the first thing. The throne of David, it means that he's coming from the Davidic royal line. Not only that, but he will sit on the throne of David. Now, to look in the New Testament on any other indication of fulfillment of this, we find nothing. And instead of being anointed as a king, Messiah is the anointed one. Instead of being anointed, he is baptized by John the Baptist with the sinners. There's no point after this announcement that we know that Jesus was a king. However, I believe that this is the point that points out to the real historical character of Jesus. He's a king, and he belongs to the dynasty of David. Now, if we look at the story of David in the Old Testament, we find that the dynasty of David had only 3 kings: David himself, and Solomon, and then Rehoboam. All ruled, the 3 of them, during the 10th century BC, according to the Bible. And Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, didn't last long after the death of his father. And then no dynasty of David any long disappeared. No kingdom of David disappeared. But here we have instead, because the Bible mentioned different informations coming from different sources, but does not point, is not a historical work. In fact, in some cases, there was a deliberate attempt to hide the historical part of the story. But if we look to King David, okay, look.
Who was David in the history, Mr. Osman?
Okay, in Book of Samuel, we know about David from Samuel. We have Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, 2 books of Samuel, and then books of the Kings, and then Chronicles. They talk about David. David was a shepherd, an ordinary guy with music and so on, and then suddenly he's involved with the and he challenged Goliath and so on. Anyhow, when we come to his being anointed by Samuel as king of Israel, we find that we have 2 accounts in the same story of Samuel. Two accounts, two contradicting accounts. One account gives us a story of David with 600 followers who follow him from one. He was working for the Philistines at a certain stage. Then he moved around and worked for the king of Israel and so on, before he himself becoming a king. Even when he became a king, and when he's said to have entered Jerusalem, his son Absalom kicks him out of the city. He escapes and crosses the Jordan, running out. After, he's not that established king in the kingdom. In this account, we have this account tell us about a tribal leader with some followers. However, we have some other stories within the Samuel account, which makes him a great warrior with 1,000 chariots, who goes to northern Syria across the Euphrates to re-establish, not to establish, to re-establish his lost empire. Did he have, or did his father have, an empire reaching across the Euphrates and down to the borders of Egypt, and he lost it? According even to the story of the Bible, he has no. But this is one of the accounts of Samuel indicate that David went out to recover his empire between the Euphrates and the borders of Egypt. Here we find a mighty warrior with a strong army who defeats many cities, many towns, destroys them, and conquer and establish a great empire. Then Solomon gets it from him. If I ask you a question, who is the Prime Minister of Britain who during the Second World War united the British and helped to defeat Hitler? Everybody will know it's Churchill. Without mentioning his name, once you know what he did and where he lived, you automatically identify his character. So let us see who was the king who established an empire between the Euphrates and the borders of Egypt, and conquered the very same cities mentioned in the Bible to have been conquered by David. You see, at the 10th century BC, there is no archaeological evidence or historical evidence of any kind of an empire extending in this area. The Assyrian Empire came later in the 9th century, and the Babylonian were followed, and then the Persian. Before that, the only empire that extended between the Euphrates and the Nile was an Egyptian empire established by Thutmose III. Thutmose III established.
So Thutmose III, you mean, is
in the history? Yeah. So in this case, if you look at the story of Thutmose III, compare it with the David as it is written in the Bible, in some part of the biblical stories, not all of it, you find that it's only one guy who fits that, which is Thutmose III. Napoleon of the ancient, who established the first ever empire to extend between the river Euphrates and the river Nile.
So what was the name of Jesus in the history?
No, I wouldn't like to tell you that at this stage, because we have to go through some different points. I just want to identify the King David of whose son, from whose dynasty included a king later on identified as Jesus, will be Thutmose III. And so Jesus is a historical character, but he is of royalty, as the statement of Luke says. But I have to tell you something, because here the Masons will be angry, a little bit upset, because they think that their master, the builder, was Hiram Abif, was really the savior, the redeemer. But I have spoken now about the Messiah, the king. The redeemer and the king are two separate things. And although the Messiah, the king, the anointed one, historically speaking, came from the dynasty, royal dynasty of David, the Christian message, the first church ever which was established, it was established in Egypt again by the healers.
The first church, you mean?
The first church ever. And strangely enough, it was established before the 20th centuries AD, when Jesus, according to the New Testament, died or crucified between 30 and 33 AD. We have a church, without mentioning, talks about the Redeemer, the Savior, but does not mention the name of Christ. But it is, by Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote the history of the church, identifies the healers, the Therapeuti of Alexandria, as the first church in his book in Egypt. This church was established at least 10 years, if not more, before the Bible dates for the crucifixion of Jesus. No mention of Jesus, but a mention of salvation, the Savior. So the Christian church was born from within the cult of the Redeemer, who could be the master Mason who, by the way, lived very near in historical terms with the historical Messiah. They lived within the same 20 years in the same period. And it is within the cult of Hermes Trismegistus that the idea of a unified word, unified spirit, the unification appeared. And what is salvation? Salvation is people wanted to live eternally, and obviously Babylonians tried with Bitnabishtim and so on to look for the fountain of water that can, if they drink from it, they live it. This is the first attempt by man, but eventually it became, within the cult of the Hermetic master, it was, identification of the self. You go inside. God is not outside, God is inside. Part of God is inside. Once you realize that you within yourself have a spiritual dimension, have a spirit which is part of the universal spirit, you have there and then have become eternal. You have moved to eternity. And this is salvation, the Savior who taught people, who help people to identify their inner spiritual self and so become eternal. And this was done even before Jesus Christ has been crucified according to the New Testament.
So we will carry on in the next part. So more interesting stories we promise to come. Thank you very much, Mr. Osman.
Thank you.